Finally, is there anything people trying to get into the industry should know about that you don't think they're told often enough?
So my initial blurb is always tailor your resume, always write a cover letter. Those are both really important. We want to see, when it comes to tailoring your resume, you are helping the hiring manager get exactly what they're looking for. I honestly don't even mind when someone takes my job description and says, this is why I have this skill, this is why I have this skill, just makes it a laundry list. Honestly, saves me so much time. When it comes to writing a cover letter, we want to know about the kind of person that you are, and we want to know that we're hiring someone who's real on the other side of that. So always, 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 always write a cover letter. It helps to play to your strengths, and if you have skills working in a game of a particular variety, you're likely to find work working on a similar game. So sometimes working for competitors, working on sequels, etc., things like that. Know your worth, stay relevant, do your research, stay humble. The game industry is very small, and when people don't like you, people will know about it. Be passionate and show your passion. We want passionate people. I don't want to work with someone who doesn't care about what they're doing. So be passionate and show your passion. Don't be a fanboy. Be genuine when it comes to networking. Develop relationships that are genuine and not just because you're trying to get a job out of this person. It's very obvious when someone is only talking to someone because they want to get a job, and it just doesn't look good. And then also be aware of the game industry and its downsides before getting employed. Do your research. I actually happen to have a list of the pros and cons of working in the game industry, so how convenient for you. So when it comes to pros, I would say that pros for working in the industry is, number one, getting to be creative, getting to work on things that are not your everyday, coming up with ideas, brainstorming, working in a team, and just coming up with something great. Followed by a non-corporate working environment. This isn't true across the board, but generally in the game industry, most people work in a relatively casual manner. There's not like suits and ties and corporate environment. It's typically a little bit more casual, as I have blue hair. So working with people with shared interests is a very good pro to working in the industry. You're never going to be bored because pretty much everyone around you is a nerd and they're into probably the same things as you are, TV shows, whatnot. So it's very common to find friends and connections in the industry. Awesome fans and engaging community are a huge boost to working in the industry. Hearing about the amazing experiences that players have had with your product and the things that it's done for their life, it's an incredible feeling to be able to know that you're a part of that. So another amazing plus. Teaching people is another great aspect of working in the industry. I get to teach you how to get into the industry, and it's an awesome feeling. Company resources can always be a bonus too. Our company is very generous in that we provide a library of games and board games and things for our company to share in and participate, so that's always really fun. Attendance to industry-related events is a good bonus too. Most Comic-Cons and things like that offer industry attendance as long as you can prove your employment in a studio, because it's considered research towards your work. So very cool. Those are the pros for working in the game industry. Now, my cons are going to be longer than that list. It's not an equal balance, and I think that's just because the pros of working in the game industry are so much bigger. So now, when it comes to working in the game industry, as I mentioned earlier, the long hours, overtime and crunch time is, while not an industry standard, very, very common. It's something that you need to be aware of when you're going into the industry. If you are just punch in, punch out, you're probably not going to go very far, because we want people who are in it to win it and in for to make the project happen, essentially. And sometimes crunch time is necessary, so be aware of that when getting into the industry. Another con would be working on something that you might not be interested in or being out of scope. I've seen folks that have worked maybe 5 years on like Britney Spears games and or perhaps like kids mobile games, and and they're just like, oh, I just want to make real games or something. And while those are very, very much real games, sometimes you'll end up working on a project that you're not interested in. When it comes to being out of scope, sometimes you have ideas that just can't become a reality in the project. Sometimes, whether it's budget, whether it's time, whether it's manpower, those things can't come to fruition, and something you need to come to grips with when being in the industry. Another con would be not being good at what you're interested in, or being good at something you don't like. This is something that I've come across quite a few times, actually. Sometimes a person's skills lie, or maybe the opportunities that they've had in the past lie in a particular field, but what they really want to do is design or something like that. And sometimes a studio has the resources to allow them to make that transition. Sometimes not. It really depends. But sometimes you're not going to be good at what you want to do. And you need to either work towards fixing that, or maybe figure out what you really want to do. Do you want to risk working something that you don't like to do to stay in the industry, or do you want to try and focus on the thing that you do like to do and perhaps have less opportunities doing so? Not owning your work. That is a huge downside as well. Most companies that you work for will require you to sign a non-disclosure agreement and non-competition agreement sometimes too, that involves, it basically says the work that I do here belongs to the company and not myself. It varies depending on where you work, but sometimes you're not ever allowed to share the things that you work on. It happens sometimes. Canned projects are a really big downside too. Sometimes a project is planned and it's in the works, perhaps it's even halfway through, and then something happens, maybe a publisher pulls out and the project is canned, and essentially that information disappears. It's not shared with the public. There's many projects out there that people don't even know about, that studios perhaps worked on, that just disappear into the ether. Moving around for work is a common issue that people have faced in the industry, because the game industry has such hubs, with the Bay Area being the #1 area for game industry, followed by Seattle, and probably followed then by the Los Angeles and Orange County areas. Sometimes people find themselves, if they're living out in the middle of nowhere, they might have to move for jobs, and then if that opportunity goes through, they might need to move around again and again and again to finally find a place to settle down. There was a really good Kotaku article about this, actually. Being paid less than other industries. This is not across the board, and this is not indicative of any studio in particular at all, but some disciplines are paid less than the exact same work done in software development. It's an unfortunate truth, and it's just one of those things that I guess due to a lack of regulation when it comes to video games and the industry, there's nobody keeping a track of that sort of thing, so unfortunately certain disciplines will be paid less than other disciplines. Sometimes they even out, sometimes over time when they get to mid or senior, the pay actually reaches the same level, but it is sometimes paid less than other industries. And then the last bit of negative about working in the industry is toxic community feedback. If you've ever encountered a scandal on the internet about, this game wasn't what I wanted, or this game is buggy, or gamers have a lot of opinions, and the truth is that once you start working in the game industry, you cease to be a gamer, at least in that regard. When you have that high-level understanding of game development and how things are done and the sacrifices that are taken to make things happen, you start to understand why some of these things happen the way that they are. And so when a developer promises a certain thing and then later down the line has to deliver a product that may not have met that promise, as a developer, you might understand why that happened, but the lay gamer does not. And sometimes there's just really, really toxic feedback. I mean, you've probably heard of studio execs needing guards to stay safe from various public outbursts and stuff, so sometimes it can get really nasty. And then I wanted to go into game industry disciplines because some people aren't actually aware of what kind of different disciplines are in the industry. When it comes to working in AAA or studios that are larger, you're going to be doing a lot more specialized work than if you're working at a small studio or maybe like a team of developers at school. You're going to be wearing more hats and you're going to be doing more on that project, and you're going to be responsible for more decisions made in smaller team projects. When you're working in a larger studio, the larger it goes, the more specialized you're going to be. When it comes to design, there are three main disciplines in design. There's going to be narrative design, which is responsible for all stories, texts, dialogues, and item descriptions, everything like that. Systems design, which is responsible for essentially the rules of the game, anything that involves math, so the cost of items in the game, the frequency at which they appear, the rules of combat, how much damage an attack will do, that sort of thing, leveling skills and how they progress, that sort of thing. And then the last field of design would be levels or area design. So this comes to designing a space and how it will aid the player in achieving their objective. So for example, an FPS designer will deal a lot with covers and strategic placing of cover for where enemies come out of and shooting from behind that cover. Now this industry discipline is not typically included in design, but I like to consider it in design because I feel like it is relevant to design, at least while their skill set is vastly different to the other three. I feel that the work that they do is most relevant to design, and that is audio design. Audio design is not considered to be a design role because the work that they do is obviously more specialized towards sound and sound effects and practical effects. But the way that they create sound in games and the importance of sound in games, I believe, is the same effect that designers have on games. You don't realize it when a game is designed really well because you're enjoying yourself. But if you're having a bad time, if there's a hard level, if there's a difficult boss, if there's like a broken thing, you notice it. And I feel the same way about audio. I feel that you don't notice when audio is fantastic and it makes you feel immersed into the experience. But when the audio is really bad and jarring or maybe not complete, you notice. And I feel like as a result, I believe that audio belongs in the design suite of industry disciplines. Very important role. Programming. Now this gets really wide. As I mentioned before, programming is the most sought after discipline in video games, and it can get very specific depending on how large your project is and the needs of your project. You can have a graphics programmer, which is responsible for all the visuals, and engine programming, so working with the engine that the game's framework is dependent on. Build programming, which would be generating builds every day for testers or other developers to work on. Sometimes you have different kinds of builds. You have the builds that all the players are using. You might have a press build that press people are using. You might have a build that is being updated every day for the developers to use. You might even have multiple builds, like for maybe a publisher build and a developer build. It can be very varied, so sometimes a specific programmer is required to manage all of those things. AI programming is responsible for the movement of objects and the rules that occupy their movement. So sometimes, like Satan sports games, the way that the players move and react to the player. Gameplay programming, similar sort of to AI, responsible for the way that the game operates, larger scale than AI, but in general, the operation of the game. Server programming, this is a little bit larger side, but sometimes if a game runs on a server, like if it's an MMO or something, you might need some back-end programming for managing that sort of stuff. Tools programming, sometimes a game is built on a framework that doesn't exist yet. And in this case, we'll bring in people that are like tools programmers that will develop tools that don't exist yet for the developers to be able to make the game that we're trying to make. Sometimes tools developers will just work on a tool set that's not relevant to games itself. It might just be studio-wide. And sometimes they'll work on a specific game task. So that's another programming discipline. Network programming. This is sort of similar to server programming, but important network programming, essentially. Web developing, that's another, there's a lot of web developers out there, and very useful role for managing websites, and also back-end stuff. Sometimes if you have a browser game, you could use a lot of web developers there, so that sort of thing. Physics programming, sort of similar to AI programming or gameplay. Sometimes their specific role is the way that objects react. So in the case of perhaps an object coming apart into multiple pieces, or maybe projectiles that are being moved, a physics programmer would be responsible for the way that objects react. UI programming. UI is the user interface of every game, and a UI programmer is responsible for hooking up all of those buttons and things to work the way that they should be working. So sometimes you'll have programming roles specific to operating systems. So if a game is available on, say, Mac, PC, and Linux, you might have a specific programmer dealing with Windows, dealing with Mac, dealing with Linux. So sometimes you'll have a role doing that specifically. And then audio programming. This is a lot more rare of a job, but I've seen it, and it's essentially hooking up audio assets into the game. It's a very tedious task that sometimes the audio department doesn't have time for, and an audio programmer would be responsible for implementing audio assets into the game, just the way that you would do art assets or anything like that. So, a lot of disciplines there. For art, one of the most probably well-known and popular fields in art is concepts and illustration. This is definitely the hardest art discipline to get into. Most artists who enter the industry don't start with concepts and illustration. They will start with environment or anything like that, and then work their way up over the time of their career towards concepts and illustration. UI artists, very useful, very sought after work that's hard to find. They're responsible for the interface, as I mentioned before, drawing it, making sure that it is visually appealing and functional towards, it meets the needs of the game, the project, the publisher, the genre, really everything. So, environment artists are responsible for the spaces in games. So this can, whether this is a 2D level, this is a 3D space. If it's an MMO, it might be a huge map. Any of those things. Character modeling is similar to concepts and illustration, but a character modeler will take the 2D concept that the concept artist has made and generate a 3D detailed 3D model of the character, and that will eventually get handed off to animation to make move. Animation is, as I mentioned, the moving of a character or object in the game. Lighting artists, sometimes, depending on the engine and depending on the game, you'll have artists specifically responsible for lighting in places. There's all kinds of technology out there these days that involves not just painting objects the way that they should look, but creating lighting that is reactive and responsive to the environment that they're in. So sometimes lighting art is very important. Special effects involves all sorts of flourishes really in the game, whether it's, sparkles, dust, effects that occur in the game, whether it's, rocks falling over, things like that. Textures. Sometimes when it comes to 3D modeling, there will be an environment made in 3D or objects made in 3D, and then the objects themselves will not be painted by the artist. A texture artist will come in and give them the look that they should be. So a modeler will create the object, and a texture artist will give it the color and the texture that the object should have. And then tech art. One of my favorite, actually, roles in the art suite of in disciplines is there's a lot of different kinds of tech artists out there. Some of them are going to be responsible, similar to animation, they're going to be responsible for rigging and verts. They're going to be, sometimes they're responsible for optimization and making sure objects don't have a huge amount of polygons, so it's affecting the performance of the game. There's a lot of different kinds of tech art roles out there, so definitely do your research if you're interested in that sort of thing. And then production. So this is a little bit larger of a discipline because a lot of different people can be producers. In some teams, a designer is doing a producer role and that sort of thing, but a producer generally is responsible for managing the organization of the project, whether it's deadlines, whether it's keeping on budget, maintaining communication with a publisher, things like that. They're responsible for teams getting things done on time and those deadlines being met in order to meet the deadline of the project. So sometimes there's publishing work where it comes to marketing or PR, things like that. So there's PR and community managing roles that are available in games. Outsource management is another, sometimes art or audio assets are being made by outsourced studios, and sometimes there's people needed to manage that work so it's coming into the studio at the right time and that it's what the designers are looking for, that sort of thing. And project management is similar to a general producer, but essentially they would just manage a whole project. It's kind of a higher production role. Okay, and the last thing I have is the skills needed to work in the game industry, regardless of your discipline and regardless of the things that you already know, regardless of things that you learn in school, anything like that. I think this is relevant to every discipline, anyone that works in the industry. So the number one, as I mentioned before, is passion. Being a passionate developer really makes a difference. It's very clear when someone is working and they're not passionate about what they're doing. So being passionate is just absolute number one working in the industry. Communication is a huge, this is a big deal for a lot of people, just being able to communicate how you're working, what you're working on, how long it's going to take. Sometimes these are skills that people really struggle with, and it's an important skill when, especially in the next thing I'm about to mention. Since, as I mentioned, game development is a team sport, communication is pivotal. So the next thing I was going to mention was teamwork. Most of the time when you're developing, you will be working in a team. You need to be able to accept responsibility for things that you're working on, accept it when you've made a mistake. You need to accept responsibility for the things that you've done. You need to coordinate with the people around you and work together. You know, everyone's working together to achieve the same goal, and you need to be able to work with those people. I would say that one of the number one reasons that people lose work in the industry is their inability to work in a team. Learning is definitely a big part of working in the industry. Now, game development is really slow. It's a really slow process, and sometimes by the time you emerge, say you start a project from its concept stages, and you work on a project until support, and it's finished and everything's done. That project could have taken many, 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 many years. At a minimum, most AAA game projects start at around a year, and they can go for many years depending on the studio that you're working on. In that time, if you haven't grown your skills on the project, you might become obsolete, because this industry grows every day. And I've seen it happen before where people have worked many years on the same project, like say an MMO. This happens all the time. Someone has worked 15 years on an MMO, and in that time they did their one job, and perhaps they grew from, say, a junior to a senior, but they're not aware of other things happening in the industry. They may not be aware of current technologies, current processes, current software engines, anything like that. This happens all the time, and it's important to stay up to date on things coming out and try and learn new things and develop yourself in your own time. Planning is an important skill, being able to see what you're going to do, understand how long it's going to take you, understand why it's going to take you that long, and be able to extrapolate how long a list of tasks might take you. This is really important for production especially, and it's important for the team member because they will be expected to know how long they will take to do something. Listening is a very important skill. Sometimes people get very caught up in, I want to do this, and I think it'd be a really great idea, and that, like, here's why I want it to happen, and maybe there is a number of reasons why that doesn't work, and it's never personal, but sometimes just being able to listen to other people is more valuable than many other things. I'm not saying that creative ideas aren't valuable, but some people just are unable to accept criticism, unable to accept responsibility. Another one of those many skills relevant to teamwork. Being able to just listen to other people, very huge skill. Discretion is a very important and unexpected skill that you need in the industry. Most things you'll operate on are going to be under NDA or under some sort of non-compete contract, and it may be very exciting to share things that you're working on, but they do need to be private sometimes, and you need to know how not to share that information. Diligence, it's sort of a given, but hard work is an important skill. If you aren't willing to put in the work or put in the time to get something done, then sorry, I can't help you. Networking is an extremely important skill and something that you'll find is extremely relevant in the industry, especially when you're getting into it. This industry is very small when it comes to people working. Someone's probably knows someone who knows someone, or even less, 6 degrees of separation. When you expand your network and you get to know people, you'll find that the opportunities for you grow. Also, if you are someone who is not operating well on a team or maybe not doing well, people are going to know about it. And you can't expect to be able to just go to another studio and just do whatever you want, pretty much. People will know. People will definitely know about what you're doing. And the last skill I would say would be critical thinking. I think that's really relevant anywhere, but to be able to see your work and see where you can improve, see others' work and see where they can improve, very important skill to be able to do anything, really. So that would be all of my skills needed to work in the industry.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries.